In this video, we're diving deep into the history of a 1957 Airbox Corvette. It's one of only 43 cars built with this airbox system, and it's one of only about 15 examples known to exist today. This Airbox Corvette survived all those years. It got raced in California. It actually got shipped over to Okinawa, Japan, and then eventually found its way into a barn in Estill County, Kentucky, where it sat for 46 years. And now it's back out there, and most importantly, it's been restored completely, front to back, with authentic components, a beautiful black paint job, and of course those numbers on the hood and the door to signify this car's racing history. So the guy who owns this car now, his name is Dale Flynn, and he's from Estill County, Kentucky. And he's dealt with a lot of Corvettes over the years. He's built the Corvettes, he's bought and sold and traded Corvettes. He is definitely a Corvette guy, and he knew about this car for lots of years. He says it was about 1980 when he first heard about it, and there was no mention of its racing history or anything like that. And it took him about 10 years to actually reach out to the guy. So now we're into around 1990. He reached out to the guy, which was only about 10 miles away from his house. Well, at that time, he had no interest in selling it. He was going to fix the car up someday. And many, many years later, we're talking 2017, Dale got an unexpected message that this car was available. So he made pretty quick work out of it. He went to go look at the car, and it was rough. There's no doubt this thing had been beat up, it had been raced, it had been used up, but the potential was there for a project car. So Dale bought the car from a guy named Troy Mason. Now, he's the one who had held on to this thing for so many years. It was literally stored in a barn for 46 years and was only recently pulled out of the barn and put into another storage area before Dale came through and bought the car. At this point, there was no information that was pointing him towards this being an airbox car or a big brake car. It just happened to be a rough old race car, and some of the information he was going by was what Troy Mason was telling him based on his experience with the car. So, the full story wasn't there, but a really interesting thing happened when he made the deal on this car. They had a hard time getting it registered, and that's because this car was previously titled in Japan. Obviously, this was an odd detail for a 57 Corvette. So Troy let him know a little bit of the history, but he didn't have that full picture of why this car ended up in Japan. So on that title, it actually had the previous owner's name. So now he's got Troy Mason to tell him some details, plus he has the previous owner's name before Troy bought it, and that guy's name is Roger Daisley. So Dale takes off on a mission to figure out the history of this car. And luckily, Roger Daisley was pretty easy to get a hold of, and that also led to Roger saying he thought he bought it from a guy whose last name was Coyle, C-O-Y-L-E. And that led Dale even further down the rabbit hole, researching this car's history, and he found everything that he needed. So even though I love researching cars, I'm not taking any credit for the research on this one. This is all Dale Flynn. He and his family and his friends, and he had a network of people that were just scouring the internet, reaching out to people, putting people together so that he could really piece together the history of this car. And he did an absolutely fantastic job. There's nothing more that you could find on this car. He's got all the ownership history, he's got lots of great pictures and information, and in order to tell this car's story, we're going to start from day one. So when Chevrolet came out with the Corvette, the general idea was to build a two-seater sports car, but the original cars had six-cylinder engines. They were not necessarily performance-oriented vehicles. Even though those six cylinders ran pretty good, these things were not super sporty. But that all changed in 1955 with the introduction of the small block Chevrolet engine. So at that time, just about anybody could walk up to a Chevrolet dealership and order one of these cars with the fuel injection, making good horsepower. You could get a manual transmission and really go out there and burn up the streets. But Chevrolet also made a very special version of this car that was specifically built for racing. And these cars are commonly called airbox cars. And the reason for that is they have a handmade airbox that feeds into that fuel injection system. Now these airboxes are a little bit crude. They're not exactly what you'd consider showroom ready, but they were great for these race cars. And they fed into that fuel injection system. They also fed fresh air to the braking system. All right, so let's talk numbers for just a second. In 1957, Chevrolet built 6,339 Corvettes. Of those, 1,040 of them came with the Rochester fuel injection system. There were 4 versions of the fuel-injected 283 small block, and RPO code 579E was the custom Airbox version. Only 43 of them were built. RPO 684 was for heavy-duty racing suspension, and this option also included the bigger brakes with extra cooling. The racing suspension package included an extra leaf spring out back that increased the spring rate. There was also custom coil springs on the front to increase the spring rate. These cars had different shocks, they had a different sway bar on the front, and they even had a quick steering adapter to make these cars more responsive. The braking system was completely custom. The backing plates, the drums, the shoes, the linings, everything about this, aside from maybe the wheel cylinders, were different than just your regular run-of-the-mill Corvette. So your standard Corvette had a 15 by 5 inch wheel with a full wheel cover, and most of those were ordered with wide white wall tires. On the cars with big brakes and racing suspension, the wheels would not fit over those bigger drums. So extra wide wheels were used. These are 15 by 5.5, only a half-inch difference. But they would not accept the original full wheel covers. So these cars were delivered from the factory with small wheel covers, dog dish caps. Only 51 cars left the factory with RPO 684 heavy-duty suspension, big brakes, and the big wheels. And only 43 cars left the factory with the Airbox. But most of these cars had both sets of options combined into one high-performance car. These cars also had side exit exhaust. They had a steering column mounted tachometer. These things were stripped down in all the right places and upgraded in all the right places. Select dealerships and racers had access to these Airbox cars because these were not cars that you just see roaming around on the street. They were not cars you'd see just at your regular dealership. So nearly every one of these 43 Airbox cars turned into a race car. And we all know what happens to race cars. They get beat up, they get wrecked, they get demolished, they get parted out, they get scrapped. Sometimes they get stolen and they're gone forever. There's just a lot of bad endings to race cars. But a handful of these cars survived. We believe that there's about 15 of these cars floating around, and they're all extremely valuable. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars for one of these Airbox cars. But the thing that makes this car more valuable is the documentation, and that's what we're going to get into right now. Dale's car was built on September 3rd, 1957, making it very late in the production run. In fact, the last 57 Corvette was built on September 6th, so it's possible that this was the very last of the Airbox cars to be built. This car started its life at Harry Mann Chevrolet Company in Southern California, which was known as America's largest Corvette dealer. And in this clipping from the LA Mirror newspaper from December 19, 1957, we see several Corvettes listed in the classified section. We've got a 1954, 55, 56, and two 57s, one of which is competition equipped, fuel injection, 283 horsepower, and 4-speed transmission. This thing's listed for $2,995, and that is the car that we're talking about today. So when that newspaper came out, a guy by the name of Jack Coyle, who everybody called Jack, saw it and went to that dealership and traded in his 57 Bel Air and drove this Airbox big brake Corvette home. So you can see in these two photos of the car, it's got white wall tires on it. It doesn't have any hubcaps whatsoever. And even though the date on this print is May of 1959, we can see on the license plate that it's got 1956 tags on it. So the likely situation here is that these pictures didn't get developed until May of 1959, but the picture was taken a couple years before that. So that's just an assumption on my part. Maybe the tags were expired. I'm not real sure, but this is definitely one of the earliest pictures of this car. Now in this group of pictures, we can see this is pretty early on in the car's career. The only thing that's listed on these pictures is time trials. So I'm not really sure where these pictures were taken, but I do see a development date of March 1960, which is probably the earliest evidence that we have of this car being in race form. Another picture in this group is from Sherman Pass. You can see the beautiful scenery in the background. The car's got a roof on it here, and you can see also a racing stripe down the middle of the car. Here are a couple more pictures from 1960, this time developed in July of 60, and the note on these pictures is Mission Hill, and this car ran up the Mission Hill Climb, and you can see it looks like some pretty treacherous terrain here. He raced it as the number 22 at Pomona Raceway during Grand Prix events and SCCA events, and this thing was still black with the silver coves, but he had made some body modifications, including taping up the headlights, removing the bumpers, removing the windshield, adding a roll bar, just typical modifications that you would do on a road race car of that era. So through the years, he was continually upgrading this thing, making more horsepower, making it handle better, but ultimately you're still dealing with skinny tires, you're still dealing with a small cubic inch V8, and there were some obvious limitations as the new Corvettes were coming out in 1963 and many other sports cars that were on the market at the time. And unfortunately, he ended up getting in an accident with the car where he ran over a hay bale and it did some damage to the body and the paint. So he removed the black paint, painted the car bright red, and changed the numbers to 220. So ultimately, Jack ended up slowing down his racing program pretty significantly, but not before entering a bucket list style event called the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. This was and still is an iconic event with a lot of danger and a lot of prestige built in. And in 1964, this event was filled with legends of the racing world. So Jack entered his Corvette, and he placed 8th in the sports car division behind Bobby Unser, who ultimately won the event. You can see in this picture here from Pikes Peak, he spun the car out and ran up on the berm, probably doing a little bit of front end damage, maybe even some suspension damage in the process, but that was just part of the game with Pikes Peak. It was a dangerous race. It was a thrilling race, and it was definitely a big deal to be a part of it. If you're enjoying this video, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and share this with your friends. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and you'll see more of my videos in the future. So in this sports car class at Pikes Peak, you had some serious cars here. So Bobby Unser won this thing in a Lotus, which is a really exotic car. He finished in 13 minutes, 19.1 seconds. And then we go back to 8th place. That's where Jack Coyle is. His 57 Corvette finished it in 15 minutes, 37.4 seconds. So he didn't finish last by any means, but he was certainly outgunned some big names competing in this sports car division. During all this research, the Flynn family reached out to Jack's daughter, Peggy, who had posted online looking for some pictures in a magazine with her dad's 57 Corvette in it. And this unlocked even more information, including a detail that Jack sold the car for $800 and bought a Ford Thunderbird. I really like this picture that's developed in April of 1967. You can see this thing is on a single axle open trailer, red with red steel wheels. At this point it's got a little bit wider tire on it than what it originally ran, but still no front bumpers. You can see they've pinned the hood down. This is definitely evolving into more of a cut-up race car. Even though it still looks like a Corvette, this thing has been pieced back together multiple times at this point. And now for a change of pace, this picture was developed in May of 1967, and you can see that this thing looks like a street car again. All of a sudden, it's got a regular windshield, it's got a folding top, it's got rear bumpers on it. You know, this thing has been transformed back into street duty, and I'm assuming this was done in preparation to sell the car and move on to another project. But it was not a conventional transaction. He sold this car to Roger Daisley, who was stationed in Okinawa, Japan at the time. So Roger was a big-time car guy, and even though he was stationed in Japan, he still carried his car enthusiasm with him everywhere he went. And he and some friends there that he was serving with, they got together and had a little hobby shop where they worked on their cars. And because he was still very interested in the American car scene, he had magazines shipped to him while he was stationed in Japan. And one day he was looking at the National Speed Sport News magazine, and he saw a 57 Corvette that was for sale in California. So Roger sent a letter and some money to his sister who lived in Laguna Beach, California, near where the car was located, and he told her to go look at it and buy this car if it looks good. And then Roger worked it out with the sergeant to ship the car to Japan. Now Roger had already shipped a car over there, so he had reached his limit, but he worked it out where somebody else would do it under their name, and he got the car over there so he could start working on it and potentially racing it there. Things escalated pretty quickly for Roger on this car. You can see that they've taken some of the trim off the car. They've added the circle with the number 22, which strangely enough carried on the tradition of this car. which typically ran the number 22 or the number 220. And you can see a couple other details here. The wheels are black. They're a little wider than what they were originally. Roger worked on the car relentlessly and raced it a few times while it was overseas. He raced in the Macao Grand Prix in 1967 and 1968. He also raced in some hill climb events near Okinawa and enjoyed working on this car. And he's the one responsible for taking the fuel injection off of it and actually gave it to one of his buddies that he served with. So there's no telling where that fuel injection system ended up, but he replaced it with a cross ram and 2 4-barrel carburetor setup. Here's a picture you don't want to see, but it's the unfortunate reality of a lot of old school race cars and even new race cars. These things are driven hard, they're pushed to their absolute limits, and they often get wrecked. These pictures of this car being shipped to and from the racetrack are just amazing. Seeing this thing being hoisted in the air, seeing the people gathering around it. I mean, it was probably a really big deal for these locals to see a car of this nature and to see it being transported from one place to another. And part of that documentation that we have on this car is records of its transport, which was really expensive back in the day. I mean, this was hundreds of dollars to ship this thing to and from the race, and there was really no way around it. If you were going to race and transport your car overseas or to a different country at that time, you were going to have to spend the money to do it. Undoubtedly, this is the meanest this car ever looked right here. The car has a pretty fresh paint job on it. It's got a low windscreen that goes all the way across. It's got that same roll bar that's been in there for quite a while now, and you can see that license plate strapped onto the roll bar, which is probably some sort of legal thing overseas. I'm not really sure, because you don't necessarily have to have a race car registered in the United States, but I would imagine there was some rule about that overseas. But you can see the blacked out headlights, the blacked out grill surround, no grill whatsoever, just open. And then you can see those 2 Holley 4-barrels poking up out of the hood. This thing looks mean with those black wheels and the big Goodyear tires. It had come a long way from those early days in Pomona. So here's another really cool nugget on this car and yet another piece of documentation on it. So this says, "I express my sincere appreciation to Goodyear for supplying me with the racing tires I needed for the Macao Grand Prix. Although I did not win the race, I attribute 70% of my Corvette's excellent performance directly to your Goodyear tires. The braking and cornering power of those tires is nothing short of phenomenal." You want more documentation? We got it right here. This is a business card that says Okinawa Racing Team, Roger W. Daisley, car number 22 Chevrolet Corvette. This is just so cool that he went through the trouble to make these business cards and kept them so that we can document this car's history to this level of detail. Roger was an Air Force fighter pilot in the 82nd Fighter Interceptor Squad. He flew F-102s and said that he eventually flew 502 combat missions in Southeast Asia. And he eventually ran into a guy named Troy Mason while he was at the Okinawa Hill Climb. Troy made a comment that he liked the car and they struck up a conversation, and Roger mentioned to him that he was having to sell this car within the next 10 days because he had been called to Vietnam. So they made a quick deal on this car, and Roger went on to serve in Vietnam and luckily made it home. And he's still alive to this day. He lives in Washington State, and he even went to visit this car and brought some great pictures and memorabilia and even his helmet that he used when he raced it. After making the deal on this car, Troy's biggest goal with this thing was getting it shipped home so that if he made it home, he could enjoy it while he was there. Ultimately, he did make it home safely, and so did the Corvette. So before that car could be shipped home, it had to be made street legal. So they had to put some turn signals and parking lights and mirrors and things like that to make it street legal. And then, because it had numbers painted on it and it was bright red with black racing stripes, his commander told him that it needed to be painted because it looked too much like a race car. Well, the only color available was yellow, the same that was used on taxi cabs in the area. So when the Corvette got shipped back to the United States, it was bright yellow. Troy had the car shipped to Norfolk, Virginia, and he got in that thing and drove it to his home in Estill County, Kentucky. And after he got the car home, of course he worked on it here and there, and he actually drag raced this thing at Clay City and ultimately blew up the engine in this thing. So after that happened, this car got parked, and it didn't get seen by hardly anybody for the next 46 years. So we'll see a lot of evidence of some serious changes from when this thing was in Japan to when it came back to the United States. So when it was in Japan, it was a full-on race car. It was stripped down, it didn't have a lot of creature comforts. But when we see these pictures, we see it's got a padded dash with rolled and pleated upholstery. It's got rolled and pleated door panels, kick panels. Got some pretty custom pieces here. And you can see that the original tachometer has been removed from the steering column, and an aftermarket sun tack has been mounted to the dash. We also see a couple of extra gauges mounted into the radio delete plate, and a couple of other aftermarket gauges have replaced the originals. Out back we can see a big rear bumper has been added, and this was pretty normal for drag racing back in the day. Some people would use it to push start the car, other people would use it as weight ballast, but either way it was pretty commonplace in the 1960s on drag cars. We can see that Okinawa tag hanging from their little back bumper deal. We can see dual exhaust coming all the way out the back, which this car previously had side exit exhaust. Oh, and that Okinawa license plate, yep, that survived too. Another piece of documentation of this car's history, and it's still with this car to this day. Here's another great picture under Troy Mason's ownership. You can see that a scoop has been added to the hood to cover up the two 4-barrel carburetors. It's got a top on it now. It's got Krager front runners and black steel wheels on the back. In fact, those are still the black steel wheels from the previous configuration. It was not known through any of these ownerships, except for Jack Coyle, that this car was a factory airbox big brake car. And even in Jack Coyle's day, he didn't really take that into consideration that this would someday be a valuable car. To him, it was just a race car. To Roger, it was just a race car. To Troy, it was just a race car. And even though it was extremely valuable and had some really rare components on it, none of that mattered through all those years. But now, fast forward to the modern age, and we're looking at a really significant and high dollar car. So when Dale was able to buy this thing, it was a big deal to uncover all of this history. It was not just, oh, this was a fuel-injected car. That would have been special enough as it is. But the fact that this was a big brake car, an airbox car, that drew attention from around the country. People were flying to Estill County, Kentucky, or at least flying to Lexington and driving to Estill County, Kentucky to look at this car. And that really accelerated when the Flynn family took this thing to Corvettes at Carlisle in Pennsylvania. And it drew a lot of attention while it was there, even though the car was rough. This is before it was restored. It was just like it was when they pulled it out of long-term storage. It was still yellow, still had a rough body on it, a lot of incorrect parts on this car, but it still had some pretty cool pieces too. Well, then the Flynn family took this car home and started taking it apart, completely stripping it down, finding all the correct parts to put this thing back together like it should be. And luckily, there was a lot of original parts still intact on here, such as the brakes, because in his research, Dale found that the brakes on this car, if you could find them, they were about $15,000 a piece. And luckily, they were all serviceable on his car, but there were some pieces that were not serviceable. So they had to really dig deep to find enough parts and to source the correct parts to make this thing 100% accurate. So because of the extreme damage and the number of times this car had been put back together, Dale decided to cut the front end off of the car and start back with fresh fiberglass. And he didn't use the hood that had the two velocity stack holes in it because it had already been gutted on the underside. So he cut the front end off and hung it up on his garage wall. You can see it here. He's got headlights, headlight rings, the original grille surround with the little marker lights. He's got the hood with velocity stacks mounted to it. And it's just so neat to me because that's keeping some of this history alive. Dale said he bought parts from 38 different states plus Canada when restoring this car. And I mean, he spent a lot of money to get it to this point, but this thing is priceless. This is an absolute treasure in the Corvette world and in the racing world too. I mean, this was a revolutionary, often considered an exotic car for 1957. So to see this thing and the amount of work that they did to bring it back to life is amazing. This car has a flawless black paint job on it, the silver coves, the trim, the red interior. I mean, it's just a beautiful combination. And of course, the black steel wheels with the small caps, not the full wheel covers. It doesn't have wide white walls like most of the Corvettes did back then. This thing's got black wall Firestones on it. It's just a stripped down car that's ready to go race. And they put the numbers back on this thing just as a tribute to this car's racing history, and the rest of it's just as it would have been when it left that dealership in December of 1957. through this car's driving and racing and everything that it went through, it only accumulated 18,240 miles in all those years. Now, there were some rough miles, they were some tough miles, but to see a car of this caliber with that low of mileage, it really shows you that this thing spent most of its time on the racetrack and not just driving around the streets of California. So a really neat piece of the puzzle here was the fact that that odometer was still hooked up and still functional and counting those miles a little bit at a time. Through all the research, Dale and his family have accumulated 5 scrapbooks that are packed with pictures and information. He even printed out conversations, text messages, every communication he's had that's led to all this information. He's got it all documented. He has a great collection of pictures and information of this car from day one until now, and that's basically unheard of with a car like this that passed around to different owners, that even went overseas and somehow, some way, made it back to the United States and got hidden away in a barn for all these years. I mean, it's incredible that this thing survived, and just the idea that multiple previous owners are still alive and still have a sharp memory that could tell him some details that he needed to know about this car and provide additional documentation. That really made all the difference in the world for this car. Even though Roger and Troy didn't necessarily become friends, they had just met long enough to make an exchange on this car, they still kind of wondered where each other ended up. So Troy knew that Roger may have been going to Vietnam to fight his final missions, but luckily both of them made it back home safely, and they were actually reunited because of this car. Dale brought them together, and they talked and met each other for the first time in decades and caught up on all of their life's adventures and all the things that had gone on in the last 50 plus years. And, you know, just being able to tie all of that together because of this car, that's when these cars become more than just fiberglass and sheet metal. That's when they become part of the family. The discovery and restoration of this car brought a lot of joy to the Flynn family, so Dale and his 2 sons, Greg and Jason, did a lot of work, hands-on, hard work, to make this car look as good as it does and run as good as it does. And then, of course, there was people all over the place, a lot of people that were contributing to the documentation on this car. So Dale admits he couldn't have done all this on his own. He had a lot of help from a lot of people. They spent countless hours researching, talking on the phone, having personal visitors come to their place to check this car out and confirm that it is one of the 43 Airbox big brake cars, and that it is Jack Coyle's car and Roger Daisley's car and Troy Mason's car. It's confirmed, it's documented, and it is an outstanding piece of automotive history.